Hi, welcome to the Read with Reese live stream. Today we're going to be talking about tropes and fantasy stories. I hope you're all ready. To start out with, I want to talk about tropes and how we see them. I think there's a lot of people that don't like tropes, that think that they are cliched and not as fun to read. And while that's totally a valid opinion, I personally really love tropes. I love knowing what to expect and really getting to see the same things over and over again. I think as people, a lot of readers do enjoy reading the same kind of stories over again because we love them. And I think it goes back to the beginning of storytelling when everyone was kind of telling stories with similar, characters and plots and I think that we as humans just always kind of gravitate to the same things. Kind of reminds me about how in Save the Cat, how there's, only like 10 or so genres that Jessica Brody lays out. And basically, those all involve tropes that make them that genre. And you can find stories that fit those tropes and those genres going back to the beginning of storytelling. So it's really fascinating. Of course, for tropes in fantasy, you have some classics like The Chosen One, The Reluctant Hero, the father figure being hurt or dying, the mysterious parentage of the hero, the Dark Lord, the hero's mentor, the going out into the world, and the quest and training montages. Hi, Kelly. Thanks for joining me. What tropes do you want to talk about today? There's so many that we could go over here. And just to preface, we will be talking about Eye of the World, but also be talking about other stories. And I haven't finished Eye of the World yet, so there won't be too many spoilers if you've read at least the beginning or know what happens in the beginning of the story. So just a caveat there. But yeah, so yeah. I love the only one bed trope. It's so great. And I know a lot of people love that one. Uh, I don't think that's happened so far in Eye of the World yet. But yeah. Yeah, so the main one that I think people think of when they think of fantasy is the chosen one trope, and there's definitely that vibe in Eye of the World. So far, we haven't really gotten to the point where that person's really been identified, but it's one of the youngins from the town from Two Rivers. So um, I think that plot line is going to develop over time. Obviously, it's a very long series, but that is such a classic trope. I think of so many stories that feature that. Harry Potter, the Sword of Truth series, so many focus on that, and I've seen other people kind of deconstruct it a little bit because it is, I think, a trope that a lot of people don't like because it is so overused, and it kind of gives you the vibe that, um, that the person is only uh, doing this big quest because they were, it's their birthright or whatever. There's nothing really inherently special about them other than they were born to do the thing. I think a lot of people appreciate stories nowadays more so if the hero either kind of stumbles into it a little bit more randomly or they choose that path for themselves and have a little bit more agency. So I'm not too much one way or the other. I think I like seeing it both ways. I think that it can be done well, either staying true to it or deconstructing it. And then we have the reluctant hero trope, which is definitely present in Eye of the World. Rand, especially, he doesn't really want to go, even though he knows that he needs to, and he kind of needs that reassurance from his dad before he takes that step out into the world. And I think what makes this interesting to people is because I think it's realistic. And it also follows the Save the Cat formula where you've got this whole big thing that's being laid out for you, and you have to kind of come to terms with that. I mean, it's such a huge change in your life, so it's understandable that somebody would be a little bit hesitant there. Oh yeah. Yeah, I love this comment, Kelly. One of the AMM mentors posted about how a lot of submissions they got this year were kind of anti-chosen one, and that the MC doesn't have magic or talent, etc. I actually really like that. I think that there's definitely room in the book world for more of these stories because they haven't been the traditional story that gets told. And I kind of love when a character kind of has a little bit more of an uphill battle. Like they're not like gifted with all this, special things, and they just have to unlock that power in order to succeed. And so I really like that they have to work a little bit harder for it, and they aren't just like a shoe in for the role that they have to play. So I think that's great. So far, we haven't really seen any of the main characters that aren't already magical use magic in Eye of the World. But as I believe, I think that that changes over time, and we kind of see Egwene use it a little bit, but she's not, uh, trained like Moraine is. So yeah, that's kind of interesting to see Moraine teaching Egwene some magic, and we get a lot of that in the beginning of the story, and Rand being really conflicted and upset about it, uh, and Snoopy Rand. And then another one that I always seem to find, not always, but a lot of times in these kind of stories, is that at the very beginning, the main character's father dies. That's what happens in Sort of Truth. Uh, Richard's father figure dies at the very beginning, and it also happens in Aragon with his uncle before he goes off on his quest. The interesting thing I find with Eye of the World is that, spoiler alert, Rand's dad gets severely injured, but he doesn't die. So it is a little bit of a twisting of that trope. I was kind of glad about it because I was expecting that he was going to die like all the other fantasy stories. So I thought that was kind of refreshing. But I really love the little scene when Rand is dragging him through the woods to town to get treatment, and his dad's rambling about all these things that Rand doesn't know about his history, and so that's definitely the like mysterious parentage trope that we see in fantasy a lot of times, where we find out that Rand isn't actually his biological child and he adopted him after he was born in a battle. So that's like really interesting, and it gives Rand something he has to question, but he still really trusts his dad, which is nice. They have a really great relationship, and it's so interesting, little tidbits we get at the beginning about the sword, and uh, it's just really great. And I will say, I haven't watched all of the Wheel of Time show yet. I watched a couple episodes, and I was having trouble getting into it. I had trouble kind of connecting with the characters, even though there was a lot to like in the show. The cinematography is really great and all that. But I really liked the book better so far. It's really common in fantasy stories to have a prologue, and so this book actually has 2, but I think they do, like, such a good job of, like, setting up the world and the conflict in a really nice way. We get to see Egwene as a young girl, and that sets up what their little town is like and what Egwene is like. And then after that, we get more of the top level, epic fantasy level prologue that kind of leads you into what the big conflict is about, and it's really traumatic. So I kind of like that. There's 2 prologues in the story, but I thought that was kind of an interesting choice. I haven't seen anybody else do that before. Um, and Yeah, so the kind of tropes that we see later on in a fantasy story, that kind of go through beyond just the beginning is the good versus evil, the Dark Lord. We very much have a Dark Lord figure in this story. I think that's so common in fantasy. I do think that Robert Jordan is kind of playing with that trope a little bit. He's not playing the good and evil, uh, as straight as it is played sometimes, like in Harry Potter. You have the Dark Lord, who is supremely evil, and the chosen one is perfectly good. And I think we see that played out too much. So I feel like this is going to develop a little bit more beyond just being black and white in that regard. But there's definitely the Dark Lord figure in the story, and then there's also the mentor, who I would say in this story so far it seems like it's Moraine, because she's the one kind of guiding them out of the two rivers and thrusting them into their journey. But I was just talking with my fiance yesterday about how the mentor isn't really the right label for that trope, we think, because the mentor figures in most fantasy stories are always kind of hiding stuff from the main character. Like, they're giving them just enough to kind of push them in the direction they want them to go, but they're not really forthcoming or always very like warm and cozy with them. So it's definitely an interesting dynamic. I would say probably one of the few stories I would say the mentor is really a mentor is The Sword of Truth, because Zedekias really guides Richard and teaches him, even though he's not infallible, and he also does hold things back from Richard. But I feel like that's a much more mentor like relationship. And I also think it's really fun in a fantasy story that we get that kind of going out into the world trope. I think that that is so foundational. It goes back to ancient storytelling tropes where the hero, leaves their world, goes out into a new one, and a lot of times they'll come back and it'll be circular, but that's not always the case. But I think that that really kind of grounds you in the world. You get to feel and experience something on a small scale, and then it grows bigger, and you get to see the whole world lay out in front of you afterwards. And that's part of the quest. The quest is one of the genre types that Jessica Brody talks about in Save the Cat, and I think that it's always a really fun trope. I like when a group of people come together and they're dealing with all sorts of challenges in the road, and there's a very concrete goal at the end. And I and the training montage has definitely already happened in Eye of the World from where I'm at, and Jordan is doing this interesting thing where he kind of is going over the quest in kind of a non chronological way, where like he talks about the training that Lana is helping the youngins with, and then he talks about how Rand is trying to figure out what's going on with Egwin, and we get that storyline. And so and those two storylines each kind of jump around in the timeline of the quest, so I think that's really fun. um are there any other tropes you want me to talk about, Kelly? um And in fantasy, we have the magic system, which every story kind of does it different. We have hard magic and soft magic systems. I'm not really preferential to either. I really like both. I think they both have something to offer a story. Soft magic is very like mysterious and grand and magical, like Gandalf, um, and it's so fun to see like all these great things that he can do. But a hard magic system is really interesting because the rules are so clear, and um, the stakes are very clear, and the magic is usually more like specific, which is kind of fun. I think there's a lot of leeway to come up with something really unique with that. Um, for example, oh, Kelly, this is a really good question, Kelly. Can we talk about how hard it is to identify what a trope is versus what is just part of fiction writing? Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know if I have like a concrete answer for that. But I would feel like a trope is more specific, and it's um pieces of the writing that appear in several different stories that share characteristics. And then there's some tropes that I feel like kind of go beyond that and apply to different, any kind of genre, like the fridging stuff and things like that can kind of happen in any genre. But fantasy, especially, I think has a lot of tropes because we're all kind of using the same language about um about fantasy. Yeah, I think this is a really good question too, Kelly. Thank you. Do you choose tropes when writing your novels, or do you let them happen naturally? I do the latter. I pretty much just kind of let them happen, but I feel like they are like cemented into my brain. So I think that they are kind of just naturally there to draw from, and because and also like I when I was younger. I read a lot of, fan fiction too, which is very tropey, because it is kind of an amalgamation of all the fantasy stories that they're commenting on and stuff, and so that and reading a lot of fantasy kinda just, embedded to my brain, but, yeah, I think it just kind of happens naturally as I come up with the story ideas. I think there's definitely room though for doing it intentionally because like with the one bed trope, like I think that's one that a lot of people will do intentionally because it's so fun. Um and it's really like it adds so much tension to the story in a fun way. And I think there's some tropes like that that are good to like add on purpose. Um yeah, my I think my favorite tropes to play with are I love training sequences. I think that that's so fun to see that the characters grow and get better over time and to not be perfect at everything. Um, in the Eye of the World training sequence, I thought it was funny that Lan was having them shoot an arrow and like every one of them hit it, the target perfectly. And I'm like, is that really realistic? These are just I mean, it's not possible, but I think it's funny when that happens. Um, yeah, and I will say that like when I was younger and writing, I think I did lean more to like the good and evil black and white stuff because that was so much of the fantasy that I'd read, like Lord of the Rings and all of that is very like black and white in that regard. And now I do kind of play with, who's good, who's bad, more complicated characters, which I think is really fun. I kind of like writing heroes that do bad things sometimes and villains that sometimes they have a good reason for what they're doing. I think that uh, is really, a fun thing to do when you're writing because it makes you really question your characters and it makes your readers um, think a little bit harder about the story. Um, even if it does make your hero sometimes a little bit more unlikable. Um, what about you, Kelly? Which do you prefer? We stand a good morally gray character. This is true. This is true. I think honestly, like if you think about not necessarily fantasy, but speculative, I like the Hunger Games, Katniss. She's kind of morally gray in some ways. She's a bit rough around the edges and wants to drown Prim's cat until she sees that Prim really loves it and stuff. So I think that's what makes that story so interesting. For sure, I think that any story that has a great character is great. Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think Big Bad Evils is very like common in middle grade. I think about like Percy Jackson where you have a lot of villains that are complicated and then you have your villains that are just bad. Like Kronos is just bad. But the gods sometimes they do really like annoying bad things, but there are moments when they, do good things and so I think you get a little bit of both. I think that's possible, but yeah, good versus evil is much more common in middle grade for sure. I think that it's becoming more of a trend to do the morally gray characters and more adult fiction. Yeah. Yeah, she really is. uh I wonder if you look at like Percy Jackson, what the tropes are for that. Because it is kind of a tropey story, but it is kind of different than a lot of other stories I've read. You definitely have like the quest trope in that, where you have the unlikely heroes, especially in the first one when their relationship isn't really cemented, and Annabeth is still kind of not sure how she feels about Percy, and Percy's still trying to find his way with everything, and then by the end of it, they're really good pals, and I really like that trope so much, getting to see like a friendship develop over time, and I think that fantasy stories um, are really good at showing that because to me, like fantasy is yeah, I love that. Yeah, messy boy falls for academic girl. That's the vibe. Absolutely. Me too. I ship it so hard. Um, though I will say I'm one of those embarrassing people that was like pronouncing it Perkabeth in my head, even though I know logically it's Persabeth. So that's a whole like debate in the fandom I know. Um, but yeah, it's great. I love them so much. But yeah, for me, like fantasy is a way to kind of explore real world things in a world that's different than ours. I think that allows you to kind of almost comment on it better because it's not so like preachy or like related to real world things, and so you can kind of be more creative, and then you also get the element of it being escapist, so you can do both or you can do either, and I think that that's really a strength of the genre. And so I think that these tropes are so common because they kind of go back to the beginning of storytelling where you had, the one character who's kind of destined for something. They go off on, a journey and go up against an evil. I think that that's just kind of really classic. And so I think a lot of writers use that framework of those tropes to kind of share something about human nature or talk more about like a real world issue or purely just for fun, which is totally valid too. I think that that's why I'm not really too bothered about tropes because I think that they kind of bring you something familiar and then you can kind of build off of that and make something a little bit more unique off of that. And it's also just really easy to read when you're familiar with the kinds of things that you're reading about in the story. I think that familiarity is really so foundational when you're reading, even though it's fun to get new things every now and again. But for example, with music, I always find that the second, third, fourth times I listen to an album, the more I love it. Like the first time, sometimes I love albums first time I listen, but a lot of times it takes like the second, third, or fourth listening to really, really love it. And I think that's because the music becomes more familiar to me. That might just be a me thing, but yes, Kelly. We love fantasy for a reason. Give me all the tropes I fell in love with as a kid. Absolutely. I read voraciously as a child. I would have like 5 books I was reading all at the same time, and I was always like bringing them to bed and just laying down and reading. That was my favorite pastime. Absolutely. And there's so many good stories, and honestly, like I still read a lot of middle grade fiction because it's just so cute. Like, I grew up reading Percy Jackson, and I'm still reading Rick Riordan books because he's just such a fabulous writer, and I really connect with the story still, and it's so engaging. Um, so I think that uh, it's kind of fun how there's those different levels. How you have the middle grade, the YA, and the adult fantasy. I think they all are really special in their own ways. Like If you want something that's, like, kind of warm and goofy, middle grade is perfect for that. YA delivers, that kind of more tension and, a little bit more complex characters. Yeah, I haven't read any, of the, Rick Riordan Presents books, but I really want to. It's on my list, of books to read. I think it's fabulous that he's doing that. Um, and then you have adult books like, Game of Thrones, which offer, really complexity when it comes to the politics and, a little bit more mature themes, and I think they all really play an important role, uh in the genre. I think that they're all great and, are valuable. Absolutely. Um, yeah, if there's, no other tropes you wanna talk about, Kelly, I think I'm gonna wrap up here. Um, but yeah, I in the comments, make sure to, after the stream, let me know what your favorite trope is or your least favorite trope, or what book you want us to talk about next. Um we're going to be, finishing Eye of the World at the end of May, so there's still time to read it if you haven't yet, and, yeah, thanks, Kelly. I really appreciated you coming on, it was great talking to you about all this. Yeah, so, yeah, we're gonna be, covering, something in April that's different than Eye of the World, because I will be, away from Read with Reese for a little while, and Inez will be leading that. And then, this summer, we're planning on, talking about some indie books, indie fantasies. So, um, any, indie fantasy books that you really like to read, have read recently or have been on your to read pile, uh, go let us know in the comments and we'll consider covering it. But yeah, thanks, Kelly, and have a good day, everyone. Make sure to subscribe for more content.